Hello, I'm Mort, welcome to the vlog! I'm not going to get a good take of that.
Hello world. Mort is using my music again. The music you are hearing in this video is by Namtao. If you like to have something to listen to while you're painting your miniatures, Namtao also produces an audio story podcast called Lost Terminal. It's about a post-apocalyptic world told through the eyes of several self-aware artificial intelligences.
Or perhaps you'd like something with a little less science and a lot more dread. In which case I recommend Modem Prometheus. Tales of dark urban folklore and the people who find themselves in the strange spaces caught between the city of the day and the city of the night.
Links to Lost Terminal and more of Namtao's work can be found in the description below.
Hello, I'm Mort, and welcome to what can only be described as another vlog. So, this vlog's going to be a little bit different from my usual ones.
But not that different.
Okay, yeah, maybe not that different. What I'm going to be doing is taking a look at some of my Dungeons and Lazers pieces. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dungeons and Lazers is not the name of the new Gloryhammer album. That's going to be called Return to the Kingdom of Fife, apparently. No, Dungeons and Lazers is a dungeon building terrain system made by Archon Studios. And it's rather good.
End of review, roll the credits, video over.
Now you can follow Mort on Instagram for more video clips and pictures.
In Britain, it's called Instant Graham.
That's probably not true.
One thing that I really like about the Dungeons and Lazers sets is they're proper model kits. They come unpainted and unassembled. No repainting pre-paints here. Because there's so much to paint, I tried to keep my paint job as straightforward and consistent as possible. Here's a quick rundown of the basic colour scheme I used. As always, I started out with a black undercoat. For the stone, I started out rather appropriately with a heavy dry brushing of army painted dark stone. This was followed even more appropriately by a medium dry brushing of dungeon grey. Then another medium dry brushing of uniform grey. Metal parts were painted with Vallejo Hogelata Tinny Tin, and highlighted with P3 pig iron for a nice battered dungeon metal look. Wooden parts were painted with Army Painter Leather Brown, and then given a wash of Citadel Agrax Earthshade. So that's the painting, but what about the assembly? Well, let's start with the floor tiles. As you can see, there are two kinds of floor tiles, singles and doubles. We'll come back to that in a moment. And the floor tiles are connected together using these clips, which work like this. You just push the clips into the bits underneath each tile and then join another tile on. And you keep going until you've got an area large enough for your dungeon. As you can see, it's pretty easy to do, but it does require some planning, and I'll explain why very soon. Here's what the underneath looks like so you can get a better idea of what's going on. So, that's the floors together, now for the walls. Like with the floor pieces, there are single and double wall pieces. The walls have pegs on the underneath, which slot into the holes where the floor tiles join together, and are held in place by the cross-shaped holes in the clips underneath the floor tiles. There's also these little round pegs, which fill the gaps where you don't have walls, but so far as I know, no one ever uses them. But there is a problem with this system. Remember when I said, as you can see, it's pretty easy to do, but it does require some planning, and I'll explain why very soon. And as you can see, there are two kinds of floor tiles, singles and doubles. We'll come back to that in a moment. Of course you do, it was less than a minute back. Well, unless you've paused the video for a couple of hours or something and are coming back to it now, but I can't help that. You should watch my videos all the way through.
And now.
And now, I will explain the problem. When you join two single tiles together, it creates a hole in which you can stick a wall. However, the double tiles don't have this hole, which obviously means a wall cannot be placed there. And the double walls create a similar but somewhat opposite problem. Both of these factors somewhat limit the flexibility of the sets. This means when designing your dungeon, you have to think very carefully about where double wall pieces and double floor pieces are going to go. In case you're wondering how big these pieces are, here's Hlekyar for scale. Probably the best thing about the Dungeons and Lazers set is the sheer variety of the pieces. As you can see here from my rotating setup, even the walls in the basic set have different details on each side. And that's not to mention all the different themed room packs available. Here's just a few of the ones I own, and I've got more on the way in the post when the next Kickstarter arrives. By combining the Dungeons and Lazers pieces I have painted already, with a few bits of my dungeon dressing terrain, I can create all kinds of themed dungeons, including ancient crypts and demonic temples, perfect for adventures inspired by Diablo and Doom. My favourite set so far is probably the Warlock's Altar, which has walls with pentagrams on one side and arcane bookcases on the other. Perfect for a wizard's library or some other repository of eldritch knowledge. Who knows what Lovecraftian horrors await you in these chambers. One thing the Dungeons and Lazers sets initially lacked was functional doors. They just had basic open archways like this. The Kickstarter did include a sprue of closed doors, which could be swapped out for the open arches, a bit like the HeroQuest doors, but you didn't really get enough of them to make that a viable way of running a dungeon. Also, half of them were for the sci-fi sets, making them pretty much useless if you don't own the sci-fi sets. And the later released Functional Doors pack has similar problems. So I decided I would do something better. I decided to make my own doors. Initially, I scratch built a prototype, using coffee stirrers and some other bits I had lying around, with a view to getting it cast in resin. I was of course going to need a lot of these doors. Gav, however, suggested I go down the 3D printing route, and put me in contact with someone who could work the software required. I provided a sketch and a few basic measurements, and after a little bit of back and forth, I had my 3D printed doors. But how do they attach to the archways? And how do they open and close? Well, here's the really clever bit. Magnetic hinges. First, I got a hacksaw and cut up some magnetic nails into 5mm sections. Then I superglued these into specially made divots on the door's edge. Next, I used a razor saw and a file to cut notches into the arches. I then took 5mm neodymium magnet cubes and glued them into the notches. I also used a smaller, weaker pair of magnets on the opposite edge of the door to keep it from swinging open. And here is the final result. I used a hole punch on some thin plasticard to create the rivets that you see on the magnets. And then painted the whole thing up using the techniques which I've divulged earlier in this very video. And yes, I think they came out rather nicely. The great thing about the magnetic hinges is, not only can the doors be opened and closed easily, but they can also be completely taken off the hinges for when adventurers kick the doors down. As well as my 3D printed doors, I also magnetised the hinges on this prison gate. Another thing I found a bit disappointing about the early Dungeons and Lazers sets was the stairs provided. A little too narrow and flimsy for my liking. What I wanted was something a bit more chunky that fills the entire width of a corridor. The sort of thing you see in Legend of Grimrock and Dungeon Master. So I went about making my own stairs, with blackjack and hookers. I mean, out of Mega Blocks. Once I'd built the basic shape I needed, I glued the bricks together, removed the not Lego studs with clippers, and used model filler to fill the holes in the model. If you're wondering what the numbers on the bricks are for, that was to help me assemble it in the right order as I was gluing it, and I was probably watching too many archaeology documentaries at the time. Here's the finished piece in the dungeon, and with Klekia for scale. I think it fits in quite well with the standard wall pieces, and I'm rather pleased with it. Another thing I made inspired by Legend of Grimrock were these rock falls. They're made out of insulation foam, gravel, coffee stirrers, and sand. These are surprisingly useful pieces. You can use them to make dead-end corridors make more sense, imply that a dungeon was much bigger than what you can fit on your tabletop, and of course as an event to trap your heroes deep in the dungeon.
Bollocks!
I also made these smaller rock piles at the same time, which can be used to make any bit of the dungeon look a bit more ruined. Especially when combined with bits like this hole-in-the-wall piece. Originally it had a very cartoony looking spider web in there, but I think it looks better and is a lot more useful without. And finally, one more thing I made especially for my Dungeons and Lazers dungeons was these spike traps. These are made from old 50mm square bases, chunks of plasticard, and actual metal nails.
At last! Something more painful to step on than Lego.
Spike traps like these appear in numerous computer games, and are a great addition to any dungeon setup. Good luck getting past that without taking any damage.
And that's about it for this vlog. If you liked this video, subscribe to my channel, and if you are subscribed to my channel, like this video. Until next time, I need a goodbye catchphrase.
Subscribe for Mort.
Y'all! I told you we weren't going to do the accents.
Oh.